The city of Jerusalem was already awake before sunrise. Merchants opened their stalls. Travelers filled the streets, and priests moved to the temple courts with serious expressions. Near the temple, Jesus sat quietly beneath the morning light, teaching the people who had gathered around him. Men, women, and children listened carefully as he spoke about mercy, truth, and the kingdom of God. His voice was calm, yet every word seemed to carry great power. Some people nodded with hope, while others whispered among themselves in amazement. But not everyone came to hear him with honest hearts. Among the crowd stood several Pharisees and religious teachers, watching him closely. They had been searching for a way to trap him in his own words. One of them leaned toward another and whispered, "Today we must force him to answer publicly." The others nodded quietly, their plan already forming in secret. Not far from the temple, chaos suddenly broke out inside a small house hidden along a narrow street. Angry voices shouted through the doorway as several men forced their way inside. A frightened woman cried out in shock as the religious leaders dragged her from a room. Her face was pale with fear and shame. Neighbors stepped back as the group pulled her through the streets without mercy. "Move aside," one Pharisee shouted harshly. "This woman has been caught in adultery." People stared as the woman stumbled forward, barely able to walk. Some whispered with pity, while others looked at her with judgment. The woman covered her face with trembling hands, tears running down her cheeks. She knew the law of Moses demanded death for such sin. Every step toward the temple felt heavier than the last. Meanwhile, the Pharisees exchanged confident smiles. They were not only accusing the woman, they were preparing a trap for Jesus himself. The crowd around Jesus suddenly parted as the religious leaders pushed forward. The woman was thrown roughly onto the dusty ground in front of him. Gasps spread to the people as silence quickly replaced the earlier conversations. One Pharisee stepped forward proudly and pointed at the trembling woman. "Teacher," he announced loudly, "this woman was caught in the very act of adultery." Another quickly added, "In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" The question hung heavily in the air. Everyone understood the danger hidden behind those words. If Jesus said she should be stoned, the people might no longer see him as merciful. But if he said she should be released, the leaders could accuse him of ignoring the law of Moses. The Pharisees folded their arms confidently. "Answer us," one demanded sharply. The woman lowered her head, expecting condemnation at any moment. For a long moment, Jesus said nothing at all. Instead, he slowly bent down and began writing with his finger on the ground. The crowd watched in confusion. Some strained their eyes, trying to see what he was writing in the dust. The Pharisees grew impatient. "Why does he not answer?" one muttered angrily. Another stepped closer and repeated the question louder. What should be done with her? But Jesus remained calm. The woman looked up briefly through her tears, surprised by his silence. Unlike the others, he was not staring at her with hatred or disgust. There was something different in his eyes, something gentle yet powerful. The murmuring crowd became restless as the tension grew heavier. Finally, one Pharisee spoke again with frustration. "Surely you cannot ignore the law," he snapped. Slowly, Jesus rose to his feet and looked directly at the men surrounding him. The entire temple court became silent as Jesus spoke. His voice was neither loud nor angry, yet every person heard him clearly. "Let him who is without sin among you," he said calmly, "be the first to throw a stone at her." His words struck the crowd like thunder. The Pharisees froze in place, their confidence suddenly shaken. No one moved. No one spoke. Jesus then bent down once more and continued writing on the ground. The silence became almost unbearable. One by one, the accusers began looking at each other uneasily. An older man lowered the stone in his hand and slowly stepped backward. Another shook his head quietly and walked away. Soon more followed behind them. The woman remained kneeling in the dust, hardly daring to breathe as the sound of departing footsteps echoed through the temple court. The older religious leaders were the first to leave the temple court. Their faces were tense, and their eyes avoided the crowd as they disappeared into the streets. Younger men followed behind them, each dropping a stone quietly on the ground before walking away. The people watching stood in stunned silence. Only moments earlier, The air had been filled with anger and accusation, but now shame and reflection seemed to cover the gathering instead. The woman slowly lifted her head, confused by what was happening. She had expected violence, not silence. One child whispered softly to his mother, "Why are they leaving?" The mother could not answer. Jesus still knelt calmly, writing in the dust as if he were giving every accuser time to examine his own heart. Soon the loud voices of condemnation were gone. Only Jesus, the woman, and the watching crowd remained in the center of the temple court. After a while, Jesus stood once again and looked around the empty space where the accusers had once stood proudly. The stones that had been ready for judgment now lay scattered across the ground. Then he turned his attention to the woman. His expression was calm, not harsh like the others had been. "Woman," he asked gently, "where are those who accused you?" The woman looked around slowly, almost unable to believe what she saw. The men who had dragged her through the streets were gone. The voices demanding her death had disappeared. Her lips trembled as she answered softly, "No one, Lord." Tears still filled her eyes, but now they were mixed with confusion and relief. The crowd leaned closer, waiting to hear what Jesus would say next. The woman herself feared that perhaps judgment would still come. But Jesus spoke words she never expected to hear. "Neither do I condemn you," Jesus said quietly. His voice carried kindness, but also truth. The woman stared at him in shock. Mercy had been shown to her when she least deserved it. Yet Jesus did not pretend that her actions were unimportant. After a brief pause, he added, "Go and sin no more." Those words settled deeply into her heart. He had not excused her sin, but he had offered her something greater than punishment, a chance to change. The woman bowed her head as tears rolled freely down her face. For the first time that morning, they were not tears of fear, but of gratitude and brokenness. Some in the crowd exchanged surprised looks. Others stood quietly, reflecting on their own hidden sins. Jesus had revealed something greater than the law of punishment. He had revealed both justice and mercy, standing together. The woman slowly rose to her feet, still trembling from everything that had happened. Her clothes were dusty and her face was stained with tears, yet something inside her had changed. She looked once more at Jesus, searching his face as though trying to understand the mercy he had shown her. "Thank you," she whispered softly. Jesus simply nodded. The crowd parted quietly as she began walking away from the temple court. No one shouted insults at her now. No one lifted a stone. The same people who had once stared at her with condemnation now watched silently as she disappeared into crowded streets of Jerusalem. Some wondered whether her life would truly change after that day. Others could not stop thinking about Jesus' words. The temple court remained strangely quiet long after the woman had gone. Even the Pharisees who had planned the trap were nowhere to be seen. Not far from the temple, the Pharisees gathered together again in frustration. One of them slammed his hand against a stone wall angrily. "He escaped the trap," he muttered bitterly. Another shook his head. "How does he always turn the people against us?" The oldest among them remained silent for a moment before speaking quietly. "Because he speaks to the hearts of men." The others frowned at his words. Deep inside, many of them knew Jesus had exposed something uncomfortable within themselves. They had come eager to condemn another person while ignoring their own sins. Yet pride kept them from admitting it openly. "We cannot allow him to continue," one Pharisee warned darkly. "The people are beginning to follow him more every day." Meanwhile, Jesus remained at the temple, continuing to teach the crowd as though nothing unusual had happened. But many who heard him that day would never forget what they had witnessed. As the morning continued, more people gathered around Jesus in the temple courts. News of what had happened spread quickly through Jerusalem. Some who arrived late asked others in hushed voices, "Is it true he saved the woman from being stoned?" Those who had witnessed the event nodded quietly. One man said, "He spoke only a few words, yet every accuser walked away." Another replied, "I have never seen wisdom like this before." Jesus continued teaching calmly, but now the people listened even more carefully than before. Many realized that his authority was unlike that of the religious leaders. He did not use fear to control people. Instead, he exposed the truth while still offering mercy. Among the crowd stood a young woman who whispered to her friend, Yet he showed mercy to her. Perhaps God has not forgotten people like us either. Hope slowly began rising in many hearts that day. Meanwhile, the woman who had been accused walked alone through the streets of Jerusalem. The sounds of the busy city surrounded her, but her mind remained fixed on Jesus' words. "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." She repeated them quietly to herself again and again. Every step felt strange, almost unreal. Only a short time earlier, she had believed her life was over. She had expected pain, humiliation, and death. Yet now she was alive and free. She stopped beside a small fountain and looked at her reflection in the water. Her face showed exhaustion, fear, and sorrow, but also something new, hope. "Why would he spare me?" she whispered softly. She knew she had sinned. She knew she deserved judgment. Yet Jesus had looked at her with compassion instead of hatred. The memory of his eyes stayed with her wherever she went. Back at the temple, one of the listeners finally gathered enough courage to ask Jesus a question. "Teacher," the man said carefully, "why did you not condemn her?" The crowd became silent again, eager to hear his answer. Jesus looked at the people surrounding him before speaking slowly. "Every person has sinned," he said. "Those who judge others while refusing to see their own sins walk in darkness." The listeners exchanged thoughtful glances. One older man lowered his head quietly. A woman standing nearby wiped tears from her eyes. Jesus continued, "God desires truth in the heart, not pride hidden behind religious appearances." His words cut deeply into many who heard them. Some remembered secret sins they had hidden for years. Others realized how quickly they condemned people around them while ignoring their own failures. The temple court no longer felt like a place of accusation. Instead, it became a place where hearts were being exposed. Later that afternoon, two Pharisees walked together through a narrow street near the marketplace. Both remained troubled by the events at the temple. His words embarrassed us before everyone. One complained angrily. The other remained quieter than usual. Finally, he sighed heavily and said, "Still," he spoke the truth. The first Pharisee stopped walking and stared at him in disbelief. "You cannot be serious," he snapped. "That woman was guilty." "Yes," the second man replied slowly. "But are we innocent?" The question hung between them awkwardly. For a moment, neither man spoke. The noise of the marketplace echoed around them as people hurried past carrying baskets and goods. The first Pharisee shook his head stubbornly. "If we begin thinking like this, everything changes." The second Pharisee looked back toward the temple in the distance. Deep down, he could not forget the silence he had felt when Jesus said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." As evening approached, Jesus and his disciples walked away from the temple toward the Mount of Olives. The city glowed beneath the orange light of the setting sun. Peter finally broke the silence among the disciples. "Master," he asked carefully, "did you know they were trying to trap you?" Jesus smiled faintly. "Yes," he answered. John looked thoughtful. "Then why did you bend down and write on the ground?" Jesus paused for a moment before replying. "Sometimes silence reveals more than arguments ever can." The disciples reflected quietly on his words. They had expected anger or debate when the Pharisees challenged him. Yet Jesus had answered with calm authority instead. Matthew shook his head in amazement. "The crowd was ready for violence," he said softly, "but you turned their hearts another way." Jesus looked toward the city below them. "Mercy can change a heart more deeply than fear," he said quietly as the evening wind moved across the hillside. That night, the woman sat alone inside her small home. A single oil lamp flickered beside her as darkness settled over Jerusalem. She could still hear the angry voices of the morning in her mind. But above them all, she remembered the calm voice of Jesus. "Neither do I condemn you." She covered her face with her hands and began to weep quietly. These tears were different from the tears she had shed earlier that day. Before, she had cried from fear and shame. Now she cried because mercy had touched her heart. She thought about the life she had been living and the choices that had led her to that terrible moment. "I cannot return to the same life," she whispered to herself. For the first time in many years, she desired something different. Hope had entered a place in her heart that had long been empty and broken. The next morning, the streets buzzed with conversation about Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. Some people praise him openly. Only a man sent by God could speak with such wisdom, one merchant declared. Others were more cautious. The Pharisees will not forget what happened. Another warned quietly. Near the temple gates, several religious leaders continued discussing the incident with frustration. The people admire him more after every encounter, one said bitterly. Another replied, he is dangerous because he reaches the hearts of ordinary people. Yet, not everyone among them was hardened. A younger scribe remained silent as the others argued. He could not stop thinking about his own hidden sins. The words of Jesus had followed him through the night, like an echo inside his mind. For the first time, he wondered whether true righteousness was more than outward appearance and strict rules. Days later, the woman returned quietly to the temple courts. She stayed near the edge of the crowd, uncertain whether anyone would recognize her. Jesus was teaching again, surrounded by listeners hanging on to every word. When he noticed her standing in the distance, his expression remained warm and calm. He did not shame her or call attention to her past. Instead, he continued speaking about the love and forgiveness of God. The woman listened with tears in her eyes. Every word seemed directed straight into her heart. A nearby woman recognized her and whispered in surprise, "Is that not the same woman from before?" Another nodded slowly. But this time, the whispers carried less judgment than curiosity. The woman who had once stood in the center of condemnation now stood quietly among people who were beginning to understand mercy for themselves. As Jesus finished teaching, many people slowly began leaving the temple. The woman remained behind for a moment, gathering courage. Finally, she stepped forward carefully. "Teacher," she said softly. Jesus turned toward her. "I want to thank you," she continued with trembling emotion. "You gave me another chance when everyone else wanted my life to end." The disciples watched quietly nearby. Jesus looked at her with compassion and replied, "A changed heart is more precious than sacrifice." The woman lowered her head respectfully. "I want to live differently now," she said. Jesus nodded gently. "Then walk in the light, and do not return to the darkness." His words filled her with both peace and responsibility. She understood that mercy was not permission to continue sinning. It was an invitation to begin a new life. With renewed strength, she quietly departed into the city once again. Long after those events, many people in Jerusalem continued speaking about the day the woman caught in adultery stood before Jesus. Some remember the shame of the accusers walking away one by one. Others remember the mercy shown to a sinner who expected death. But nearly everyone remembered the powerful words Jesus had spoken in the temple court. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Those words spread far beyond Jerusalem, challenging proud hearts everywhere. The story became a reminder that every person stands in need of mercy before God. Jesus had not ignored sin, nor had he encouraged it. Instead, he revealed that truth and compassion must walk together. The woman's life had been changed forever, not by fear, but by forgiveness. And those who witnessed that moment carried its lesson with them for years to come. That mercy has the power to transform even the most broken heart. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the Golden Bible Story page on YouTube. Follow on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. God bless you.